Hey everybody, welcome to Foundation Paper Piecing 101 for Quilted, the virtual summit. My name is Julius from www.juliushandmade.com, and I create foundation paper piecing patterns and teach foundation paper piecing sewing and design. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, go check out my website. Again, it's www.juliushandmade.com, and make sure to subscribe to the mailing list so that you don't miss out on any of the really cool new things we have coming. So for this session, I am going to teach you the basics of foundation paper piecing. We are actually going to create this panda face block together. So I have this pattern as a free pattern on my website. So go check it out, download the pattern, and you can make this block yourself. So to begin, we are going to talk about what foundation paper piecing is. We're going to talk about some of the tools that you might need. We'll talk about the anatomy of a pattern, and then we'll actually sew the pattern together. So if you're ready, let's jump right in. For those of you that don't know what foundation paper piecing is, foundation paper piecing, which is also known as FPP, is a technique in quilting where you are creating your quilts or quilt blocks using paper templates. And as you're sewing, you're actually sewing your fabric directly to those paper templates, using them as a foundation for your quilt block. So if you're used to traditional piecing for your quilts, this is going to use some new muscles, but I promise you it is not as difficult as it seems. Okay, so now that we know what foundation paper piecing is, let's talk about some of the tools and the setup that you might want for your FPP project. So starting with your machine, I'm going to recommend using a light gray thread. This is going to help with keeping the thread invisible through your seams. Sometimes if you use a darker thread like a black or even a light thread like a white, you'll see some of that thread come through your seams. With the gray, you don't have that issue. I'm also going to recommend that you use a short stitch length on your machine. So for my machine, I use a 1.5 and that works perfectly. The idea here is that the needle is going to perforate your paper as you're sewing the fabric to it. So the shorter the stitch, the more perforation you get, which is going to make it a lot easier for you to tear off your papers in the end. Okay, so some other tools that you want, an ironing surface and an iron. You'll want to be able to press your block as you go. But I do also use this little seam roller. So this is really nice though, that I don't have to run to my iron every time I do a seam. I can use my seam roller, but you can also finger press. This isn't necessary. I will recommend having some kind of rotary cutter. I use the smaller rotary cutter. I find it to be a lot easier to maneuver when I'm using cutting some of the smaller pieces. I use an add a quarter ruler. So this is a cool little tool for foundation paper piecing. It has a little notch in it so that you can cut your perfect 1/4 inch seam. And as we sew our block together, I will show you how to use that. You'll also want some paper scissors and some fabric scissors. I also use a glue stick. So I use the purple Elmer's glue. I find that to be the easiest. It comes off really easily, but also holds when you need it. Some pins, and then of course you'll want your pattern and also a cutting mat. So I recommend having all of this stuff right near your machine so you don't have to get up and go to the ironing board or go to your cutting board in between every seam. So those are going to be the tools that we use. Now that our space is set up and our machine is ready to go, let's talk about the pattern. So this is a free pattern that you can get off my website, again, www.juliushandmade.com, and this is actually one of the very first patterns that I designed as a brand new FPP designer, so I'm super excited to share this with you and make it with you. So the first page is just a cover page. It's going to tell you that the block is 12 by 12, it has my website, it shows an image of the quilt. The next page is probably one of the most important pages. This is going to give you some important information about the pattern. It's also going to give you your fabric requirements and your fabric color codes, which are on each of the pieces. So you want to make sure that you have that color code ready to go. And then it's also going to tell you the piecing instructions. So when we get to that part, I will explain what all that means as well. The next page is going to be a color image of the quilt, and it's actually going to show you each piece and what their color code is. And then following that is going to be a custom coloring page. So you can actually color this in with colored pencils to test out different color options for your panda pattern. And it is broken down by section, which we'll get to in just a little bit. And then finally, a full color page broken down by section. So all of these are going to be really important for you to use as you're piecing your blocks together, so that you can see the layout of the quilt. The last several pages of your pattern are going to be your pattern templates. So as you can see, there is a dotted line around each section, and that is your cut line. So I recommend cutting your pattern out just outside of that dotted line, because once we're finished sewing, we want to make sure that we can trim right down to that dotted line, and being able to see that line is really helpful. You'll also notice that if you cut out all of your templates and put them together, they're going to be a mirror image of what you see in the previous pages with the colored images. And that is because we are actually sewing the fabrics to the back of each template. And so when you're finished sewing it and it's trimmed, when you are looking at the fabric side, it will then match what you see in your templates. So be very careful, because they are going to be mirror images of each other. Now, looking closer at one of the sections, for example, section A, we know it's section A because each piece has a label, and it starts with a letter. So in this case, it's going to start with A, and then it's going to be a number. So the number represents the order of how you're going to piece your fabric. So for example, if you see A1, that's your first piece. A2 will be your second piece. A3, A4, etc. And it's very important that you follow this order when you're sewing, because you want to make sure that you have all the seam lines that you need. So the solid lines that you see in the template are actually your seam lines. So this is where you're going to actually be sewing your seams right along those lines. And then also you'll see under the piece label, there is a little square with a number and a color. That's going to be your color code. And you'll find that on page 2 of your instructions, so you can see what color you need to use. So now that we know what the pattern looks like, let's go ahead and let's start sewing. We're going to start with piece A, or section A rather, and we're going to look for our section A1, which is going to be this one right here, and we can see that the color is black. So I'm going to take a piece of black fabric, and I'm going to lay it on top of my piece, and I want to make sure that the fabric piece covers all the way around my piece A1 with a 1/4 of an inch all the way around it. And I can see here that my fabric does cover it. So I'm gonna take that glue stick I told you about, and on the back of the paper, you can hold it up to the light if you need to, you can see where piece A1 is. And I'm just gonna put a little dab of glue and then lay it on my fabric, on the back of my fabric. So you're going to have your fabric face down on the table. And this is the only piece that you're going to use face down. All of the remaining pieces will be face up going forward on this section. So now that I have my A1 piece of fabric on the table face down, I know that it's going to fill in all of the A1 piece, including a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to take the line that separates A1 and A2, and I'm going to fold A2 towards me. Now remember, we're looking at the pattern piece with the printed side up, so we can see exactly where all of our lines and everything are. So we are working with stitching the fabric to the back of the paper template. So I'm going to take piece A2, and on that line that separates A1 and A2, I'm going to fold A2 towards me. Okay, this is where that add a 1/4 ruler comes in. I'm going to take the add a 1/4, and where there's the little notch cut out for the 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to bump that notch up against my paper. Then I can take my rotary cutter and just cut the piece just like that. Now I have a perfect 1/4 of an inch that I can use when I'm sewing my pieces together. So now I know A2 is a piece of background. So I'm going to take a piece of background fabric, and I'm going to lay it on my table face up I want the good side of the fabric facing me. I'm going to keep my paper folded, and I'm going to position it so that my fabric, again, will cover the entire piece, and I can see through my paper. So I can see the lines for A2, and I know that this piece of fabric is going to cover it with 1/4 of an inch all the way around it, just like this. And then I'll take my add 1/4 ruler again, and I'll just trim off that little piece. Now I'm gonna grab the fabric, I'm gonna hold it together so that both pieces of fabric are together, right sides together. Bring it over to my machine, and then I'm going to open up my paper. Again, I'm looking at the printed side of the paper template. And then right on that line where A1 and A2 meet, I'm going to stitch a line just all the way to the end. I do like to backstitch. I find that backstitching just secures it a little bit better when I'm trying to pull papers off later. Okay, trim off my little threads. And now I'm going to go ahead and take my A2 piece, and I'm going to fold it back over the A2 section. And this is where my seam roller will come in. I'll go ahead and press it just like that. Now I have A1 and A2 complete. So I'm going to fold it over, and I'm going to look for A3. So again, I'm going to take where the line separates A1 and A2 from A3. I'm going to fold A3 toward me, right on the line. I'm going to use my add 1/4 ruler, and I'm going to trim that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now I can take my piece of fabric, and I know that this is a background because it has the color code here, and I'm going to lay it on top of my fabric, and I'm going to position it so that my fabric underneath covers all of A3 with that 1/4 of an inch all the way around. And then I can take my rotary cutter and just cut off that piece. Now I have my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. My fabric is all right sides together. Take it over to my machine. And so right on that line that separates A1 and A2 from A3. Once we have that sewn, we can go ahead and fold back our piece A3, give it a little press with our seam roller, and now we have A3. I do sometimes find it helpful when you have big pieces of fabric to go ahead and just put a little dab of glue. This is going to help us when we go to sew our sections together so it's not flopping around, and when we go to trim. Sometimes if you just press it a little bit with a hot iron, that's just going to allow that glue to set a little bit easier. And this glue comes off so easily. Okay, so now I have A4, so I can see the line that separates A4 from A1 and A2 is where I want to fold, and I'm going to fold A4 toward me, right on the line. I can take my add 1/4 ruler, bump up that notch right against the paper, and I know that I have a nice 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now I can take my fabric, and I'm going to align it so that my fabric covers the whole area. And I like to use little scraps of fabric as well, so sometimes I have to be a little bit finicky with it. So this one is a little bit small. I think we can make it work. There we go. And I just kind of look underneath to make sure that the fabric is covering the entire area. Now, I'll hold on to both ends, bring it to my machine. I'll go ahead and stitch. And now that I have that stitched, I'm going to unfold my fabric, give it a little press. And now we have section 1 complete. So now that we have our section complete, we can trim the block. So I'm going to flip it over so I see the printed side of the paper, and then you can see the dotted lines. So I like to cut my pattern templates out a little bit away from the dotted line so that now that it's finished, I can still see that dotted line, and that's going to be our cut line. So I just take my straight edge. You might want to use a longer one. I use my 1/4 ruler. And you're gonna cut right along that line on all sides. So anywhere you see a dotted line, that's where you're gonna cut. You want this part to be as accurate as possible because you're going to be sewing these with other pieces. You don't want to be too off or else it's not going to match up. And our last little bit. And now we can see that section A is complete. So let's talk combining your sections. So I went ahead and completed section C off camera, and now we can combine our sections. So if you look at the instructions, you will see that the first set of instructions say A plus B plus C. So it's very important when you are doing foundation paper piecing that you piece your sections together in order that it says on the instructions. So in this case, we have A plus B plus C. So we're gonna do A plus B first. So what I do is lay them out like this, and then I'm gonna go ahead and flip one side over and line up my points. You can use a pin. I often, for example, I know that the edge of the ear needs to meet the edge of the head. So I would take a pin right on that 1/4 inch seam allowance, place it there, and then through the front of the next block, place your pin there, line up your seam allowance, and then you can lock it into place. Now take it over to the machine and sew right on the line. Now when you go over your pin, go very slowly, and you want to go over right where you inserted the pin. And once your seam is sewn, I like to go ahead and just check it and make sure it all looks good. And then I remove the paper just on the seam allowance. Just like that. And then I take it over to my iron and I press my seams open. Some people like to press to one side. That's fine if that works for you. I just find that it gives a lot less bulk to your seams if you press them open, especially when you're adding multiple sections together. Okay, so now our next step after adding A plus B is to add C. Okay, and I know that my cheek point needs to match right here, so I'm going to put them right sides together. I'll go ahead and grab a pin, and I know right here is my point, and right here is where I want it to connect, right at that point. Line up my seam allowance, and I'm going to sew right on that line. Now I can go ahead and just check it, make sure that it looks okay. That looks pretty good. I'll remove my paper just from the seam allowance. And then I'll go ahead and press it open. Now you can see we have half of our block complete. So now the next instructions in our pattern say D plus E plus F. So you're going to follow the same logic where you are going to go in order. So you're going to do D plus E and then you're going to add F. I've gone ahead and done that already. So now we have our two sides. I went ahead and took the paper off. Sometimes when I have two units like this, I consider this one unit, this a separate unit. I like to remove all of my papers so that it just is a little bit easier to maneuver around and match my points. So all I do is take my papers, I kind of stretch the seam a little bit, but the small stitch length that we used is what helps to perforate that paper, and it makes it much easier to rip out. And then at this point, I also like to take some starch and just spray a little starch and then get my seams nice and flat again. And now I am ready to sew these two sections, or these two units together. So when sewing these two units together, we do have some more points that we need to match. I like to go through and make sure I match every single point along the center seam. So I'm going to put them right side together. And because I took off the papers, we don't have that guide for the 1/4 of an inch. So I do just kind of estimate the 1/4 of an inch. You can mark it. So if you get a ruler and you use a chalk pen or something like that, that is perfectly fine. But I'm going to just estimate, and I'm going to pin at every single point a 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to make sure that my pin is nice and straight, and then I can lock it into place. So go along the entire line at every point and match. This is something you want to take your time at because you want to make sure that your points all match. It's not as important when it's two of the same color, but when you're transitioning from one color to another, that's where it's going to be most noticeable, so you want to take your time and make sure you're pinning every point. And then using 1/4 inch, you'll just sew down the center. And then I will pull out my pins and I will just check to see how we did. Not too bad for rushing. And now I'll take it over to my iron and I will do this seam open as well. Another pro tip that I have for you is always press on the back of your design. It's gonna help reduce any of the shiny bits that you get when you sometimes press on the front when you have thick seams. There we go, there's our finished block. Thank you all so much for being here today and for letting me share my passion for foundation paper piecing with you. Today we've covered the basics of foundation paper piecing, but you can use these techniques that I've shown you today to create some really beautiful and elaborate quilts. So go to my website, www.juliushandmade.com, and make sure you go and download the free patterns so that you can create your own panda face block. And then also check out some of my other patterns that I have available. If you use code SUMMIT15 on checkout, you can save 15% on all of my patterns. So check that out. Also, I'm going to be offering classes. So I'll be offering classes on sewing foundation paper piecing patterns and then also designing foundation paper piecing patterns. So if you're interested in any of that, be sure to check out my website and make sure you sign up for the mailing list so that you don't miss out on any of the new things that we have coming. Finally, I do have a free block of the month club. So I release a block every month on the first of the month. And by the end of the year, you will have 12 blocks that you can use to create your own quilt. So if you're interested in that, check it out on my website. Again, it's all free and you can download the patterns right there. So until next time, I hope that I've piqued your interest in foundation paper piecing and I hope you'll go out and explore your creativity.